everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us for this launch of this important book. Really pleased to see so many of you and lots of familiar faces. I'm Corinna from Wits University Press, who's published this book. This sounds and we have quite a big contingent of this press people here. We are happy to, in fact, introduce to you. We have a publisher, Veronica Klipp here, and our ex-colleague, Rosebank, who is the publisher, the commissioning editor, and who worked on this book. So it's very nice to see you here, Rosebank. And we have a new commissioning editor, Louis Geiger, who is also here. So it's really strongly represented here tonight. Wits University Press is really very proud to have published this important book. No Last Place to Rest, Coal Mining and Dispossession in South Africa by Dineo Skosana. It's a book that's come quite a long way, and an important exploration of the struggles of families, of communities in Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where there is latest expansion of mining operations. She has been following this for many years, and she comes from a very interesting angle to this, which we'll be talking about now. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speakers here tonight. And so let me start with Dineo. Dineo Skosana calls herself a reluctant political scientist. Having said that, she is a senior researcher at SWAP. SWAP is the Society, Work and Politics Institute at Wits. And in fact, at the moment, she is the acting head of SWAP. Wits Press has had a very long relationship, in fact, with SWAP, of that we're also very proud of, starting with Eddie Webster, who was its founding director, and who sadly passed away at the end of last year, it was last year, and many other SWAP researchers over the years who have published with us. Her work investigates mining-induced, I want to say, in fact, there's also an important part of this. She's the leader of the coal mining project that examines South Africa's transition from coal mining and burning to clean energy. Her work investigates mining-induced dispossession in South Africa. She has a PhD in political science, hence the reluctant political science day. Then we're very happy to see Mbuso Nkosi here. Dr. Nkosi is the researcher, also now at SWAP, who focuses also on labor studies, on economic development, on railway studies, and he lectures in the department of sociology also at Wits, also. Importantly, he's published both Wits Press also his work that also speaks very much to this topic from his own particular angle, and the book is called These Potatoes Look Like Humans, the contested future of land, home and death in South Africa, which was published with us in 2023. Very happy to have you here in Boston. Thank you. To lead our conversation is someone who is also deeply involved, in fact, in agrarian and land research. And Yvonne, I'm really so happy that you're doing this here. Yvonne and I work together with at her venue, in her event space, which is the Forge in Rosebank, which is described on their website, and which I can attest to. That is what it is. A multi-use space for the Pan-African culture and thought from the left. And she really runs that place in a most interesting way, and do wonderful things there. But let me say a little bit more about her. She's a researcher and a writer on land. As I said, she has directed a film about farm workers, which was produced by the Forge. And she was a researcher for another film titled Matonga Ilizwe, Spirits of the Land. And I think we will be speaking about a lot of spirits of the land tonight. She's currently completing a PhD at the University of Johannesburg Sociology Department, which looks at farm workers, land, home, and belonging in South Africa. So really, we do have a triumvirate of deeply embedded thinkers, researchers on issues of land, belonging, spirit, but also what land does and how we engage with land. And maybe to set off this conversation, I thought I'll start with the quote, which is in fact a quote from Dineo, from the interview she did with the conversation. And she said in this interview, coal mining is South Africa's paradox. It's the source of the country's energy system, but it's also central to the dispossession of African communities who live in these areas of extraction. Their lives are sacrificed to keep our energy system and the economy going. So there you have your problem. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Corina, for such a warm welcome, and congratulations also to that praise. Good evening, everyone. As I have been introduced, my name is Yvonne Phillis. Those are my two names. I would like to start the conversation by congratulating Dineo on this book. And you deserve that round of applause and so much more. And I do hope that this book lands where it needs to land, in policy and legislation. It's important for so many reasons. To get us to think very deeply and very carefully about some of the most pertinent questions that are important for the future of how we think about land justice and restorative justice in this country. To center the people in the conversation, to center the families, to center the communities, to center the meanings that people attach to land, to center the spiritual in thinking about land justice in a way that we don't see in the law, in the way that the government legislates, in the policy that exists. And so this is a very important book because it gets us further. What other questions can we ask? Because the ones that we're asking are not answering, are not getting us to the future that we want for land justice and restorative justice. Because it's about the people at the end of the day. And they get us out of this restoration language, right? That dispossession is something we have to talk about it when we think about colonialism and when we think about apartheid. And this is important to think about dispossession as a continuous thing. As we're sitting now, there's somebody who's thinking about how they're going to enter a private farmland and be denied to go and see their ancestral land. There's somebody who has to deal with the blast right now and have to think about what that's doing to the environment and what that is doing to their health. These are very important questions for how we think about the future of land justice. And so I want to appreciate you for that. But also, I know I'll tell you now, but I have to. That like, nights. I know I have to do that today. There's a way in which the Dineo translates people's words that is so truthful to the accounts. In a way that you feel like you were there. Right? Because translation is not just word for word. You have to translate the context. You have to translate the culture. As Ngugi was from teaches us that language is not just a formal communication, but it is a carrier of culture. And she does that very beautifully in this book. And you know, I want to congratulate you on that. And so I think also to honor Dineo and to honor the ways in which Dineo talks about the communities, writes about the communities, as having done work with the communities and not on the communities. And I think that's a very important position to take as a researcher. And and she shows her carefulness as a researcher throughout the book, the constant conversations and negotiations she had to make with herself, to think, well, this is a very painful account that I'm hearing, that ethics tells me to not be emotional, but I'm going to share it here. Because I'm a Black person listening to Black people's stories, which are gruesome, which are painful, and how dare I have a Black face as a researcher. And she's honest about that. And I want to, please, can you just get up in the moment? So I want to start by reading very quickly. I know time is always against us. Very quickly, 3 excerpts from members of the mining affected communities. And I do this for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned, Dineo takes the position as a researcher to say she's working with communities and not on communities. And Dineo is very clear from the beginning of the book right to the end that this is a book which is co-produced between herself and the communities, which is a very important, decision to already establish in the field. And this is why it's so clear in the book, because she already established that position already in the field. So I'll do this. That's the first reason. But I think that these 3 accounts also show us some of the pertinent issues that Dineo raises in the book. And I need to explain. Why I'm talking too much as a facilitator is because I'm wearing 2 hats as a facilitator and discussing it. So I want to already start the conversation by reading from this excerpt, and I will be quick. I'm reading from Mbuso Nkosi, Dineo and Mbuso, it's page 48 in the Mpumalanga case. Mbuso Nkosi says, I did not want to leave, so they packed my things. As I sat and watched them, they never issued a date. They simply showed up on the day. Inside the truck, they combined my things with my neighbors. It was not one truck per family. My livestock was left on the farm. It was fetched by the mine only after. I was given a place that is very far from here. Macau is the way they were moved to for my livestock. I had hired someone, but I could not afford to pay them. The cost was supposed to be covered by the mine, but all this responsibility was left with me. I did not have a car, so I brought on a bicycle so that I could attend to my livestock. I had 16 cows and 21 sheep. I lost it all. I lost my livestock to theft, starvation, and illness. I lost my being. I lost my being. I lost my bank. So that's the first excerpt. The second excerpt is on page 94, Mbuso Nkosi. Just very shortly. This is in the case of Enkosom case. Just very shortly. This is at Dineo facilitated a workshop, and an elderly person stood up and said, Silala kuwo, sonke, wonke umuntu, manje umhlaba mawuthathwa yimayini, thina bantu abamnyama silale kuwo. translation. We sleep on it, everyone. Now, when the mind dispossesses the land, where must we, black people, sleep? And the very last one, on page 136. Kunzima kakhulu, kunzima. It is very difficult, it is difficult, he replied. I sometimes go to search. Emqondweni wami kube ngathi ngiyasangana. In my head, I feel like I'm going crazy. Impela akukuhle, akujwayeleki. Honestly, it is not a good thing. It is something I'm getting used to. I thought to start with those 3 excerpts, because I think they bring out some of the key issues that you write about in the book. The first account, Mbuso Nkosi. This idea that when we dispossess people from land, that is the end of the conversation, is completely flawed. Because what he's showing us is the extent of the loss, or what he lost. The things he could do on the land from which he was moved, right? His livestock. These are symbols of wealth. There's this idea that you cannot have a conversation about black people and land-based livelihood. And this is, I think, an important example to make, because what you say is that dispossession is continuous. And we know that colonialism, the complete destruction of the economic independence of black people was important. In fact, also to reduce people to labor was important, which is what we see the mines doing by offering people jobs. And so what he's showing us when he says, is that conception of, in fact, the economic independence that you could have by having the livestock, which now has lost. So he's making that connection between his economic independence or a kind of livelihood, and which is what he lost. So it's not just about moving people from land, but also what the moving means for people and what they lose. In fact, you also write about this in the 2 ways that you speak about rest. You speak about rest and you ask the question in the book, when you hear that, which means, when are we black people going to rest? Which is a question about economic and political freedom, and which is what Mr. Nkosi shows us, right? What he was able to do. In fact, there's another accountant that, when somebody says they were able to take someone in their family to university by selling their cows, right? So that's what, this is one element of the loss, and one part of the rest that Dineo talks about. The economic rest and the political economic and political freedom that Dineo talks about. And we're going to talk about the other part of rest, which relates to burial and graves. And the second one, umhlaba better wethu. And you reflect on this, of course, in the book, about the meanings that people attach to land. And this is important for thinking about, or through this thing called compensation. Because what this thing does, or when he says umhlaba better wethu, it's the second part of Dineo's lesson, which is people. Land is where people also are laid to rest. And there's something about these people being dug from their graves that just should not happen. When I read this, I was like, Dineo's taking you to places. I can't imagine somebody walking in a house and saying, listen, we are taking your grandfather and grandmother, and this is the price we want to pay for doing that. It just should not happen. And this relates to the last quote, Katata, utata umbuyezwe, talking about indlela engusajwayeleki emqondweni wami kuba ngathi kuyasangana. In my head, I feel like I'm going crazy. Honestly, it is not a good thing. It is something I am getting used to. Again, this is a question around the extent of the loss and the extent of the reproduction of the consequences of that loss. Again, it is a question of compensation when we have a restitution program that is deeply centered on this idea of compensation. What can you give me in exchange for digging up my ancestors? This is what Dineo writes about, to say there is a sense of spiritual insecurity that comes with this people. And I love for Dineo to speak about those things. But so these are three elements that I think these three excerpts bring out, right? What people lose, that's the time rate, land-based livelihood. But the spiritual, the tangible. In fact, the third, this example I'm going to search for, the father's grave is what Dineo writes about as the tangible loss and the lost ancestors. And when we say that, what is even the language of compensation? How do we ask those questions when we're thinking about the future of land justice and restorative justice in this country? When she makes it very clear that even the very laws in which she talks about legal or lawful exclusion, the gaps, the inherent gaps, are a very important part of maintaining this continuous disposition. I wanted to start the conversation that way today. And as I said when I started, to honor the communities in the way that you do in the book. But the way that you center what the communities say to bring forth and to make quite apparent your arguments in the book is very beautiful. It's of course very painful, but it's also quite beautiful to see the ways in which you are truthful at every point, with every word, about what this means for mining affected communities. And with that, I would like to hand over to Mbuso. Mbuso, I'm sure, as somebody who thinks very deeply about belonging and being in the way, in the meanings that people attach to land, that you also have things that resonated with you in this book. And so I would like to give you that opportunity to share some of the things that resonated with you in terms of
Thanks for that powerful opening. Someone, I have a request. In my imagination, when giving Dineo the number was unfortunately found. So may we please give your number to me. I hope you were able to get it, because I think this is not only about the imagination of the grace, but perhaps it's to say something, but also to speak more courage into the life, and to declare strength to the spirit, so that we may continue and also, so that tomorrow too may continue to find you in your path. Because you remind us that you are not working alone constantly. And I think the most relevant thing that you do that is really great, you write in the first person plural of we were people. That is quite radical, Then to look at more last place to us, whole mind and dispossession in South Africa, I would say perhaps is a wide range, and a sorrowful book, but an unfitting account of families who are declaring life, but at the same time enjoying the violence of dispossession and so on. But when the girl meets the families, they are reminded that she is also doing something like welcome as a person, but not only as a child, as a usual, get welcome, you feel that you are a child of the community, as the main person. They always treat you like a child, but they say something powerful in page number 25. That our parts, carrying the history of their ancestors. And in carrying this history of their ancestors, you constantly, do this radical reflection. But of course, you remind us that it is heavy. In page 49, this is where you really see your association, where you say, you even say it is true to never to Baba and to be very good and when we see, when we will be as the people for us. And this is the question you pose to the people. But throughout the book, you are posing a number of questions, and I want to return to these questions and I go into the conclusion. But perhaps what I found interesting is the first subject of critique, because it's also really scholarly work, And my joke here now is that usually teasing that I write in sociologist, and when I look at dispossession, I look at dispossession in sociologist. Then finally, for me, I got to understand what a political scientist looks at dispossession. And your first subject of critique then is the law. And as the first subject of critique, the law, you then lead it to a question of citizenship. I want to theorize a bit further about this, because we are not strangers as we are sitting here. These are conversations we've been having for almost a decade now, right? The challenge that you show us is that there's a law's failure to imagine what citizenship ought to mean in the democracy of South Africa. But if you are to define the moral order through the law, then you must confront the fact that the law is not a reliable compass for morality. Preserving the dead, disturbing their graves, and uprooting the community, you show us maybe morally wrong. But those that benefit from hope, they say they are doing it. Therefore, then you can say, this I love Jesus. Because it seems you're having a conversation with someone else here, and you say that in challenging his possession and what you call lawful exclusion through the courts, through the courts, is not sustainable. There's a conversation you're having here. But even more painful is the way in which the communities who attempt to resist are unified. Not only as opponents of development, but as threats to national interest. Because you begin with this paradox of coal. Paradox of coal is that Eskom still uses 90% of coal. The economy and coal is the activity is 70% if it counted in relation to the economy. So it's always couched in this idea of economic progress and development. So the communities who then attempt to fight, it's as if they are going against the national interest, against development. But you then say this is the first violent approach, but you have seen the violence of the various laws which you perhaps talk to. But there's also the actual violence of killing of activists. And this is brutal. You know. And the difficulty you say is that communities are treated as, you know, a collective that has agents to be consulted. And you say that consultations in the language of law are actually different from negotiations. Consultations are merely performances and a ritual to basically understand what the mind wants. In contrast, negotiation would require recognition of the community as agents in power to propose alternatives, to reject money, and assert different ways of living land, place, and life itself. And perhaps this is going to distract of what is the value of relation to life. So even more devastating is that when families are forcibly settled, the violence has not been in location. They are often moved only a few hundred meters from the violence. Sometimes 500 meters away, where the proximity to the site of destruction continues to haunt both the living and the dead. And in some cases, the graves themselves even face the lines, you know. So that the violence of dispossession then is not only spatial, it's visceral, it's embodied, it's ongoing, and even the ancestors are even forced to look at what is happening in a place where it's come. And then it shows us that perhaps even the newly built houses in Mpumalanga and Polo, even these houses, you know, are used in a way that values life according to these are poor people. And in thinking of these are poor people, you are asking a very important question. Are we as black people so poor that we are willing to sell our ancestors for 1,500 kids? And in asking this question, I started to pause a bit. And I thought, okay, this is interesting, and this is also quite painful. And when we were reading the extracts of Yvonne, I struggled to go back to them again in terms of how painful they are. But I wanted to do perhaps something that is intertextual. I wrote about the potato, and perhaps Dineo was also writing about the coal. How the coal is, you know, looking at the perhaps the smoke that rises from the blasting is not merely an environmental pollution. It takes on the character of the cosmic color. The choking, suffocating residue of the dead whose brains were violated, whose bodies were displaced, and whose bodies are asking us, what's the meaning of life? The carbon dioxide that saturates the air is not only a sign of environmental degradation, but a constant atmosphere of undeserved faith. Then in this way, the coal becomes the material archive of the evidence, rather than progress. So it is not a commodity of progress or development, only reflecting an endless cycle of dispossession and money. And you can see in the stories of Mbuso Nkosi, who has to gather the fingers, you know, touch those bones and drop them in a blanket. You can even hear in this you know, crying when it's the time, where Ziggy almost out, Ziggy was in the you know. These are not isolated events, but reptiles that continue to be in the present, refusing the lost attempt to declare closure. The dead do not rest, the living breathe. the conclusion, just to move more than time. I read the book and I was thinking, like a good political scientist, you will return to the law and perhaps start saying the policy formulation should be like this or that. The solution is that. No, we didn't do that. Instead, you then give us a set of questions. You conclude by asking questions. And these questions are, what is the citizen parliament? And what is a citizen with informal land rights? Should communities have taken these on communal land as a reform of guarding against some traditional leaders, or should communal rights be more protected, constrained to overpower the land administrative or chiefs? And what must be done with traditional leadership that is increasingly aligned with expertise? Before I go into my own questions, just to give a bit of context, because maybe you might not get your time. Throughout the book, I've been looking at these case studies. We're looking at Soken, and then we're looking at Prefontaine, right? Prefontaine is a private land that was, it's a farm, privately owned farm, right? And Soken is under traditional authority. And we still saw us that the mechanisms of dispossession are the same. The other side, the central figure perhaps is the traditional authority. In Mpumalanga, there's also the usage of the law to say what is lawful and what is not lawful. But the difference in how assistance emerges is based on an understanding of linkage with the land. And those who have been able to have, because then you not only think of the material and of the spiritual, but you also show the material meaning of land. For those who are able to farm, who are able to do have businesses, that for them this land has been able to sustain them, but now they're brought into a market, a base system that then leaves them in places where they have to now buy food. In the other parts, because there are no jobs, then they are enforced, in Mpumalanga, to think of coal as sometimes offering possibilities of jobs, but the jobs are not there. And the answer is very clear that coal, as you said, is not the way. But as I started to read, then I began to think that perhaps you are asking deeply about what does dispossession mean? And dispossession operates not as an absence of sociality, but as its violent form. It is through dispossession you show us that black life is positioned outside the boundaries of the human, outside society, without a place. And perhaps this is not a passive exclusion, but an active structuring of social life itself. It is a process of socialization. The social order premised on the disavowal of black being. And those who resist the conditions are met not with recognition, but with intensified violence, intensified death. And even when they are relocated, there's a possibility that they might move again. And this perhaps shows us this ontological awareness of a person, that there is no place in this current social order that's basically on the whole. So then, in this language of the political science of settling the question around citizenship, I kept asking myself, what comes first? Is it the law or society? Is citizenship not supposed to express a collective consciousness that articulates the community's shared values and conflicts? And if so, what happens when the law, as you show, proves inadequate, when it cannot hold, let alone heal the intentional enduring loss of dispossession? Then if the law is a tool of social exclusion, or what you call lawful exclusion, and cannot confront or repair the ontological meaning of dispossession inscribed upon black life, then how then do we begin to imagine and organize around collective interest as for people? If the land is not simply an economic asset, but the deep ontological thread that binds life, death, ancestors, trees, cattle, and the cosmos, one would need to move towards values that affirm this relationship, then push out what those values Then I then say, if I were to approach dispossession according to the lens of law, I begin to have the trouble question. Is dispossession a crime? And if so, what kind of a crime is it? Is it theft? Is it violence? Is it genocide? Is it ecocide? Or something that exceeds the judicial categories available to us? To name it as a crime is not a neutral that it demands a collective consciousness capable of recognizing the violence of dispossession, not as a regulated past as a show, but as an act that is ongoing and against life itself. But this raises even a more unsettling question of what is the collective social consciousness of the present social order, and what its values, what its ethics, what its possibilities, through which then this crime can be sanctioned, acknowledged, and acted upon. In the social order, where the law itself is complicit, foundational to dispossession, what the book has identified as lawful exclusion, can we trust the law to name this crime? Or must the naming emerge from elsewhere? From the struggles, from the memories, and the ethics of the dispossessed themselves. So what are those ethics? Perhaps these are questions that we must have. But I think what's also unsettling is that this way that we speak of as a way of claiming our relationship with the land or belonging can easily be removed. And since it can easily be removed, what does it say about the conditions of those who are yet to come in this place? Does it mean that even for them, there's the condition of knowing wellness? Because the strike is still going on. It's not the end. We have not said that when companies have won. But if then we are to call this thing a crime, those that benefit, what are they? They are self-class beneficiaries, but they become in this very only criminals. And if we come up with a collective name for such people, if we say it's a crime, does it suggest the possibility of rehabilitation? Or is rehabilitation a limited horizon, one that cannot account for the irreparable blood chance of dispossession? And show us that the technique perhaps is not enough, our chiefs are not enough, the state's language of restitution is fed up in a market-based calculation of value, while communities are left struggling for their lives, their homes, their cattle, their food. How then do we begin to think beyond the broken instruments of belonging and ask what would the vision of a collective life look like if it was not anchored in the space revolution, the market's electricities, or the lawful attempt of inclusion, but it varies on from the wound perhaps itself, from the lived histories and ongoing struggle of those who refuse to be started. So those were the things that I was thinking with on myself.
Thank you so much, also for those very thoughtful reflections that bring out so many important issues that Dineo raises in the book. And I'm going to give Dineo an opportunity to reflect on what Mbuso has shared. But I did also have two questions for Dineo, and I'll pose one already now, because Cindy Janelle, we are already been given a sign. So I'll pose the first one. Maybe there won't be time for the second one, but maybe when we all join in the conversation, we'll have time for Dineo or myself and also to engage with that whole question. It's around lawful exclusion. But what Dineo, there's a question, so also of everything that you've spoken about so thoughtfully, there's also the question that I had about what really is dispossession. And if we're talking about dispossession as continuous dispossession, what makes it possible and what maintains it, because there's something that maintains it. It's not a self-perpetuating system. And Dineo answers this question. By saying there's a relationship that exists between the state and other forms of authority. For instance, traditional authorities, in the Sonkele case, colonially traditional authorities, and lawful exclusion, and capital. That relationship is one of the ways in which the dispossession continues, and is one of the things that maintains this dispossession, that maintains the consequences of the reproduction of the loss that comes as a consequence of this continuous dispossession, in the way that it undermines people's informal land rights, for instance, the environment, for instance, all these laws that exist. And so, while she has a chapter on lawful exclusion, but she also makes lawful exclusion part of this relationship that exists, that maintains this continuous dispossession, and that actual fact reproduces over generations and over time. And I would like to know for you to reflect on that, and how you have seen it affect the families, individuals, communities, in both of the case studies that you write about in Mpumalanga and case study.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. You could have been elsewhere, but you've come to listen and to hear about the book. So thank you so much. That is appreciated. And thank you so much, Yvonne, for your remarks, as well as you. So this has really a long, ongoing conversation for years now that we have amongst ourselves and in the public as well. So I really appreciate the thoughts and care that you're putting into sharing your reading of the book. Yvonne, I'm going to start with you, particularly speaking to the rationale of the exclusion. And I think for your benefit, just to give you a sense of this book and what we mean by lawful exclusion, I'm just going to paint the picture a little bit for you. So in South Africa, the minerals are state-owned, right? So what you find underneath, which is coal, the mineral, is state-owned. But the state facilitates the exploration of this mineral and the mining of this mineral. That's one. And what regulates that is the mineral law, which is the NPRPA. So that's the first law. Two, then you have people who live on the surface. And the communities that I described, the first community is in the Mpumalanga province, where they live on covered farmland. And what it means is that when the mining company comes in, they will negotiate with the farm owner, who will then agree to sell the land. And people over that piece of land have what we call informal land rights. So they're protected by EPLR. And the same goes to Sonkele, which is customary land, it's community land. It's administered by a traditional authority in South Africa, and that will be common, particularly on traditional land. Now, again, the same people have got informal land rights. So what is underneath is owned by the state and administered by the state. The people who live on top have got informal land rights. They don't necessarily own what's underneath. And the way in which the law is executed also means they don't have a say, where legally they're supposed to have a say, right? So that's what happens over there. But there's also another question that I bring on to this conversation, which is their heritage, which are ancestral graves. Now, those ancestral graves are regulated by the Heritage Act, right? So then you've got an intersection of trees, of course, excluding the environmental law, right? But you've got 3 pieces of legislation regulating this particular cases that I'm speaking about.
where the one protects the mineral, but the other one tries to protect the ancestral graves, and the other one tries to protect people's minerals. And so what then happens, and these are the laws that are formulated post-1994. And I'm arguing that the gaps within the legislative framework, right? Gaps, for example, around what consultation is, what it ought to look like, how it should be executed. My argument is that the gaps around such nitty-gritties which are not articulated allows for the exclusion of the very same communities which the laws were written in order to dehumanize post-1994. So then what happens is that dispossession in some ways, or the experience replicates itself post-1994. And so I've written this case to then show exactly what you articulated, to say that dispossession is a continuous experience in South Africa. Many of you, you have studied historians and so on. You think about dispossession as a term, you think about apartheid, about the colonial period, and you don't think about how this is a continuous experience today under a completely different government, under a government that was meant to bring about economic freedom and different kinds of aspirations. So that is the problem that I'm pointing to, or an argument that I'm facing. And the second point which you touched on, and you connected it nicely to questions around compensation, in which the book is shown, is that dispossession or loss is also intangible. And that's why we have brought in the stories around grave exhumations and grave burials. Because I was trying to show workers how, when we thought about dispossession, historically, particularly historians, they didn't quite capture that intangible loss. So what else is lost when the land is lost? And I'm arguing that the spiritual ties, the connections and being that is written around the land through ancestral graves, through sacred sites, and that communities lose. And so then it's a serious question when you say, then how do you compensate that? And that is a critical question in South Africa that we're dealing with. The court systems are saying, for example, how should we compensate your homes and so on, right? And all men argue that if you even ask us that question, how can you compensate, you're actually saying there's everything right with the relocation of our people where they live. When in fact, the idea has always been that when you bury someone, that's their place of rest, you'll never have to wake them up again. But in this case, an activist has said this, that PT and I said from them to so we now don't have this idea that one is now being going to their final place of rest, because the idea is that they will be uprooted and placed elsewhere for home. So indeed, as we said in your introduction, call it South Africa's paradox, right? Migrant companies are basically saying, and reflect on this, that we will move your ancestors because they will not keep this economy going, right? They're not going to create jobs. And so we will move them because we need to keep our lives on. So it's a trade-off. But Mbuso, just to come back to your question about the future and notions of citizenship, I'm arguing here that, if you think and read the literature around dispossession in South Africa, land was the source through which citizenship was stripped off from African people. So it was that, it was nationalizing land to strip off the dignity, to humanize, and to create that sense of nowhereness, the lack of home. And so then I'm arguing, and before I get to how I'm arguing, communities, as I was interviewing them, particularly in the Mpumalanga province, had said to me, one of the problems we have with the grave exhumations and the reburials, so the relocations, is that the graves are actually evidence. They are evidence of our existence, of our being, of our identity and heritage.
So when you remove this particular levels of mind and how it actually, disturbs the environment and changes the physical space, you are erasing our history of the past. And they argue that they're using this history and this evidence, particularly in land claims in South Africa, because they know in cases around restitution. So if you've got that ancestral brain, whether it's within your homestead or in an upper cemetery, you can actually demonstrate that you're a big of this language, that your history is written around this place and that you're connected. And so when you remove that, you actually then, erase that history. And so they become the wandering people as, like you was describing, particularly in 1918, for example. But then my argument with tying to questions about citizenship is that why is it that an African person post-1994 in this period in 2025 needs evidence to prove one that they were violated and dispossessed? And why is it that as a citizen, you have to show that indeed you were violated? Basically means that nobody believes you, right? But I do think that is influenced, the state project and how they think about land reform and trying to prove that indeed you were violated. And, when you're speaking about is this a crime, should it be punished? We haven't dealt with it in South Africa as if it was a crime. And how you see that we haven't is that we have a land reform project that is market oriented, that has to buy land back from the municipality. And now that we've seen that that project is not working, we want him to then expropriate the land so that we can have compensation. So that is the very core of the problem, and I think it touches to those questions. And just in closing, just so that we can now speak to everyone who's in the audience, your question about the future is so important because I'll tell you what, we're now shifting to critical minerals, particularly under the mineral infrastructure. So coal is being phased out. Probably in the next 2 to 8 years, we'll be thinking about other ways of generating energy. And at the moment, we are going with a mixed energy system. But my argument has been with that in future, you can have the same social problems, social questions, economic problems, political problems, resurfacing within a big energy system. So you could have people being dispossessed for windmill farms, depending whether we go, nuclear, whichever type of energy system we listen to. And so what it shows is that if we do not deal with the land question in South Africa, if we don't deal with the question around traditional authority, what the role of traditional leaders is, in this current political dispensation, you would have the same outcome. You would hear again speaking about these very same problems, but speaking up about these within the framework of renewable energy.
Thank you so much, Dineo, for your reflection. So we are now going to allow for everyone to join into the conversation, comments, questions, sharing stories. The corridor has been already microphone for this.
I see 2 hands here. Yeah. Identify
I was raised well, so leaders first.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dineo. I'd really love to hear more about how you came to this research, what questions you had at the beginning, and what was happening at the start of this project.
There's a really powerful book, it's really deep actually. My question is, as you engage with the community one-on-one, right? How actually did you actually go about your daily life by writing this book without affecting you how they live their life in the moment.
Thank you. I have two more minutes. Shall we take those?
Congratulations, Dineo. My question is, around the intersection of the transition, the transition to renewable energy, and also the land question, and the role of the mines in producing power in the country. How do we, as Mbuso, how do we imagine the future there? If the question of land has not been addressed, and you are cautioning us to be thinking seriously of dispossession, not as an event, but as a continuous thing that is constantly happening. And I'm particularly thinking of what Mbuso was saying, that when people are engaged in resistance, in struggle, there's this violence. But I would imagine that those who are holding capital will not want resistance. They will not want people to organize themselves. Because there's something there when people resist, when they fight for what they think belongs to them. What do you make of that resistance? And is there enough happening on the ground in terms of that aspect of organizing and resisting? And what could be a response at that level? Outside the state and outside even party politics, at the level of communities, because I imagine these things happen, outside of the public eye. The stories that you are sort of writing about, the stories that are happening, not on the everyday media are reported and imagined. So how do we then begin, to organize ourselves and can even see possibilities in that regard?
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to congratulate you, Ms. Smith. My name is Dineo. And my questions are, you mentioned 3 areas of legislation. I'm going to focus on the South African heritage associations. This is their responsibility. I wonder if you had any interaction with them, or because this is a national competence, but a burial grounds and graves unit that is supposed to be looking at these issues. Section 24 of their National Heritage Resources Act, 1979, supposed to be working in communities and helping the activism of the communities is supposed to be strengthened by SAGA. And when people are being killed, the institution of the state cannot be killed by the criminals. It's supposed to be there protecting. So I wonder if the people of Mpumalanga, I know that the crafts, the provincial heritage resource authorities are dead and useless, still trying to influence system and man. So I wonder if SARA really avail themselves to the community. Thank you.
Thank you for those, and they're quite many questions, but I'm just going to try also go through some of these quickly. With the first one, how I arrived at this research, I mean, I go a bit into detail, but I wouldn't want to share too much here, but just to say that this emerged out of my PhD study, which was looking at coal mining and greater locations in South Africa, but specifically looking at the Mpumalanga province. But again, I reflect on how I even got to that question. It was through some work that I had done for LAC, which is Land and Accountability Research Institution. Institute is based at UCT. At the time it was CAS, Center for the Growing Society. And it was in 2012, 2013, where the land restitution bill had been passed. not trusted for public hearings around the land restitution bill and we're thinking of passing it to an end. And so about 2 hearings of Parliament where I attended at least 7 of us, 14. And in fact, some of these hearings and research had Scotland covered in the Eastern Cape province. And what was interesting for me in those hearings is that it was meant to be a hearing based on the land restitution bill where people are talking about the market-centered approach to restitution and the problems of that, or settlement problems and what could be amended so that the lowest phrase differently. But I was struck specifically by how people tried, particularly the old people who come in front. In public hearings, it's spaced as weight about 250 to 300 people max coming from all walks of life. They'll come and stand in front and start to cry about their ancestral graves. To say that the land that they claim, and sometimes their ancestral graves, they are not allowed access to those. And that often the land that is returned is the land that doesn't have those ancestral graves. In fact, that involves our next project at SWAT, which I'm working on with Simon. And so I got preoccupied with this idea of what is the relevance or the importance of an ancestral grave? And how does it tie into questions around land? I mean, I was still a bit naive at the time, but I learned with time that ancestral graves are site declarations. And so people can treat them simply as, there's a space for the dead. But I also started having conversations now again with the SOR to say, there's histories of written within cemeteries. There's struggles, there's history of violence. If you go within these cemeteries, you can see, particularly so beginning, where there's about 300 unmarked graves, for example, in one cemetery, and you move on to another and find the same. And this is mainly because Tendele actually didn't adhere to the heritage that we are speaking about. They hired local men, and you sound like you're familiar with the law. I mean, it articulates that if graves are 60 years old, if they are 100 years old, you exhume and you bury them differently because they might have fossilized, they've changed. And so if you like an undertaker, like an unemployed guy from the back street, they won't handle these with care because they sometimes look like the actual soil itself, depending on the precisely, you summarize their archaeological sites, their historical sites if they're 60 years old, and that's how it's articulated in the law. And so then that's how I got preoccupied with ancestral graves, but tying them to questions that are around the land. And I do think, and I hope this is what you take out from this book, umhlaba wobhede wethu silala kuwo. Wonke umuntu manje umhlaba mawuthatha ngomayini thina abantu abamnyama silalini, the lands are being sold. The mining companies are taking our land. Where should we the people be placed in grace? And that just tells you about the sacredness of the land beyond really its materiality, to say that's where people are being returned to, that's where history is made and so on. So it just tells you why the land is important, and which has been really introduced in the public discourse to say, why do people want the land back? Just give them jobs, right? Just give them jobs. They wouldn't know what to do with the land anyway. That's really the rhetoric that you find in the discourse, which is problematic because it doesn't quite take into account those kinds of discussions, right? Sorry, I'm just going through these questions not in order, but the Sama in the province, as we said, it's a mess. Now, in KZN, because they've got their own provincial legislation, it's going to involve a bigger mess. And also, what it means is that, this is actually evidence that you can use in court to prosecute, but there's also sensitivities around, it could be as easy as taking a marker, for example, right? And Saga National to some Kelly for them to go see those unmarked graves which have been lost because the proper marking system wasn't used. it's that, but it's also a negotiated process that one has to have within themselves because it is dangerous. I mean, it's already out, but doing that is taking very to the next level. And it's a conversation we have to do as researchers that now that their camp is here, should we then call Sarah to actually come and see what is happening? And what does that mean for the researcher, for the community? You know, it's but maybe something that has to be done because research can't stop with publication. So it's the responsibility maybe here of the researcher to then take this evidence so that the Sarah, which is a stakeholder, can kind of actually see what has happened and we see how we take this matter forward. But again, I must tell you, someone has asked about the emotions in the process they research. It's a physical compromise because it's so pain is quite violent. We spoke about the violence. My previous internist was killed in October, and a lot of people that I reflect on this in the pain of violence received SMSs. People were in struggle for over 10 years and now being told, if you don't need to the relocations, you will come for your family, we know where you are. You know, during COVID, I was getting themselves to a point where in fact, some kids also reflect about this in the book. You know, I've been told when I was old, one time I was negotiating with the house, you know, for some reason, and so I'm kidding. And I have been told, you don't eat, you don't drink when we get to the meeting. So I do not eat when I go to my because basically you're showing the valuations that actually happen outside. So it's a very emotional, you know, someone asked about an emotional aspect. It's a very emotional process and if you look at my videos half the time during my presentation, I'm a mess. Because families really left out not on you because they haven't received. So you are the first person to actually ask questions about it. So what have you lost? Tell me about the observations. What did you see? Where did they live where you were? Were you prepared? How is it now to not be able to go to your father's grave? Do you know where it is? Many of them don't. They know where the graves are, but they don't know specifically. So they know the cemetery, but they don't know which specific grave. And to ask, what does that do to you? They'll tell you about all kinds of things that, for example, unearth themselves as they go to traditional healers, psychological, spiritual problems around closure. And that shows you what dispossession does to a society. And those people will then tell you, and for others it's frustration, for others it's a central belief that I'm not getting the job because my father's unhappy. I'm not able to have children. I'm not able to find a life partner. Because I need to resolve that problem. It's a central belief for many people, and the core in their thinking. And so that is a big problem. I hope I've answered those in ways that actually intersect. Just the last one on resistance. So Kenya has been quite strong in demonstrating some kind of resistance, and I reflect on this, and so you touch on it, and it shows the meaning of land is that when people have the land, they've got something to fall back on. So it means they might not have money, but they will not go to bed hungry on one evening in that 1 week. Right? They could be repeating the same thing. So parents speak about their love history rotated. They could eat it for an entire month, repeating it, and it gives them some kind of ability to exist. So when a mining company comes and offers jobs that are very, precarious, it's wage work, and sometimes even doesn't labor from other communities can say we don't want jobs because I've been living on this land. So the land is like some kind of security, right? You come with spiritual security that the communities can rely on. And so without that, really it humanizes. And you can also think in that way comparatively with Zimbabwe, for example, where the economic situation is really dire. There is something there that we have, which South Africans really don't have. And just this is the last point. I was talking to a student today in wanted to look at South Africa and Zimbabwe comparatively. And I said, yes, you should. And I said to them, I have been meaning, this is a very personal story, I have been meaning, and she's from Zimbabwe, well, a previous attitude. And I've seen something of dignity that comes with her having a piece of home and land. Therefore, because what it means is that if I somehow mistreated her or I was violent towards her, she can really quit the job. Yes, it means that she was lost a bit of money, but there's some dignity that the land afforded her, and for her to be able to say, on Christmas, I'm going to my house, to my land, and it might be a wonderful structure. She's shown me, it's when you see it, when you think about class and so on, and the material reductions, and you can think, when it's just a concrete structure and with a thatched roof, but even that itself gives her some kind of dignity and humanity and a point of return where she needs to be buried. So she doesn't have that problem about where will I be buried, which we always speak about. Where will I be buried if you don't like a piece of land? Where am I returning to? And where am I going to grab this history where my children can come and visit me and say this is my father, my grandfather, my father, and so on. So there is dignity in that or some kind of rehumanization that I think people get from having this thing called land.
I thought that there was something lined up for one to ask a question and you wanted to. So can we make the final two questions, please? Okay. I think we'll have to wrap up and we have one that you have here.
Hi, Dineo. I just want to ask, with now the information that you have after conducting this, okay, after conducting these studies with these families, what would you say is the main contributing factor to them losing this battle and end up being dispossessed? And would you say it is the law? Would you say it is them not having sufficient knowledge on how to navigate the system? Or are there different factors that come together to contribute to that? Because to me it sounds like it is a losing battle, and it's a battle that will go on for generations and generations. And according to your knowledge and in your experience, do you think there is a way to navigate the system in order for it to be a win for these communities and for these families?
Yes. Hi, Dineo. Sorry, Dr. Dineo. It was only Doctor that you were asking this. Congratulations on your book. It's very emotive and violent topic that you ventured into. I just wanted to find out, would it be different if the economic benefits of these mining houses and energy companies, development, infrastructure, are accrued to these communities? If they had to move the graves themselves, if they had to develop these entities themselves through exploration, and actually those communities own the coal mine, would the sentiment be different from an Australian company coming in and constructing the land? Yes.
So thinking of those, I think was the first one. I'd say it's a combination. So it's not just really one contributing factor. As I've indicated, it's the law, but it's also a lot of unresolved questions. I mean, in South Africa, we grappled with the land question to a point where we're still left on a question in the middle. For example, on a customary land, we still grappling with that communal customary land, for example, entitlement. Would a title deed assist, for example, in protecting individual families? And what would that do then to community living? So these are questions that we have had sometimes as academics together with the state, and the state mostly limits on, and then it becomes too difficult of a question to resolve and it's left like that. And we'll turn to it towards election hearing. That is the problem. But it also shows you how, the land in South Africa is recognized as like a political work, and we've seen also the international developments in how you evoke questions around and refer particular peoples, but not peoples is relating to questions around social justice. That is a problem. In the book, I explore particularly the role of traditional leaders, which I call them agents of dispossession. Because what they've done basically in South Africa is that they've facilitated dispossession, right? They've paved ways that allow for the dispossession of African people to a point, and that's why I actually concluded the book by saying that what is their role? Because traditional leaders, supposed to be the custodians. In fact, they're labeled as the custodians of culture, constitutionally and legislatively, and of course other pieces of legislation that is very over the years to kind of articulate what their role is. And I'm saying there's everything wrong with not answering that question, what their role is, because symbolically and customary law, they want the rights to administer the land, maybe of course there's municipalities, then there's a state that owns the land, particularly on communal land. And I'm arguing that I'm not returning to those questions and all asking them differently. We then leave it, and then these issues, particularly the law where there's gaps and capitalism with growing interest, but in this case, struggling for the last bit of coal just before we actually shift, kind of like resources. And then what happens is that us as well, politicians, they don't have political imagination. Yes, to think, what are the alternatives? Right? There's also a lack of political will, but there's also key players here that are benefiting. The small companies, which you're also not speaking about, those companies are actually benefiting, but it's not sustainable. It's not in the ways that actually creates wealth, and that speaks to the second question. It doesn't generate wealth long-term. Mining companies that were spent for about 20 years, often they then sell to the next company, and you can't trace them. Right? Because you don't quite see, who did Tendele actually belong to Hitman, but Hitman dissolved or claimed or went liquidated and so on and so forth. Then there's problems around it in terms of who then do you hold accountable, right? And so your question, which is the second question, that ties to that very closely, I do think the narrative will be slightly different. Because in this case, communities have been given 1,005 for the relocation of their ancestral graves, for example. And they were not consulted, so it's called a wake fee, and you know by the Heritage Act. It's called a wake fee, it's not very regulated, it's left in the discretion of companies, which is a big problem, right? At the same time, they built one school, Glenville built a school called Makau Secondary School, but there are already schools in Bola, and that's all that they built. The roads are decent, the trusts on tribal land, the people who sit within the trust and the traditional leader is one of the signatory persons. You don't know what happens particularly with that land on trust, right? And the web of platinum caps, for example, on the platinum has shown that these the trust kind of system, the money doesn't trickle down to communities, similar to the story of the Bangladesh, even though they are slightly model or a slightly different approach. But often what it shows is that mining is actually not beneficial to communities. And perhaps if it was, then we'd be in a different kind of a conversation where there's shared evidence, there's shared gains and losses. But in this case, there aren't, and that is why there is a problem. And just in closing, one of the problems really, and I must just be one, is the treating of African people as really just really wanted to vote. So giving them suffrage, and I think I argue that that's what 1994 really did for African people. course, there's others benefits and so on that we relate and so on when you compare the apartheid system to the law to the democratic dispensation. But really, if you don't see an African person as human enough to consult, and you don't hear his or hers or theirs, they know as a no to one, then that means that person is not, they are not equal. That means they are still grabbing towards equality or being at the same level of negotiation with you. And that is the problem. The government sees its people as insignificant. So then, and then they'll tell them that you need development, you need this job. But they don't ask them, how else do you think people survive? What do you think we know? You see with the land restitution and all these traditional courts, there were all these laws that were scraped. They were scraped because basically legislative processes weren't followed, they were not consulted, right? And what that shows is that really there's still an undermining of the African voice in the party. If that they haven't reached the point where they're treated as equal citizens with equal rights and so on. And think about it, what are the social problems that emerge out of that, right? There's a lot, and we can speak about that. Until those questions are resolved, we will really not, and some kind of acknowledgement, some kind of accountability, political will, I think then we can have a conversation. But until then, I'm afraid the future doesn't pray. Doesn't pray for a better often we.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dineo, for offering us another introduction through your book. And thank you so much, Yvonne, and also for expanding on that and asking questions that make us really think. Please join us for a glass of